Hello. Conflicts of interest are difficult to explain, and yet a natural instinct we have that we perceive as intuition seems to spark right into action as soon as our internal radar picks up the scent of such a conflict. I have to clarify here, for only one of the two types of conflicts of interest is instantly picked up on our radar screens. The other type seems to require the use of reason to detect and does not trigger as much jealousy and anger. Additionally, people are pretty naive when it comes to such conflicts, which I call structural, institutional, or systemic interchangeably, as distinct from personal conflicts of interest. Therefore, I'm going to explain here how the two types differ and zero in on the institutional type, since it seems to elude us so much. We don't miss a beat in going after someone like Bernie Madoff, who embezzles, but we do tend to look the other way, even when we read, for example, that public accounting firms still get paid by the companies that the firms independently audit. Now, by still, I have in mind even after the Dodd-Frank financial reform law that came into effect in 2010, that the law does not change the way CPA firms are paid is itself an indication of how tolerant, or rather naive, we as a society are. We tend to take at face value the heartfelt claims by auditors that they would never, ever allow themselves to erroneously issue an unqualified or passing audit to a client, so the company's management will retain the audit firm for the next year, essentially renewing the audit firm's contract. It is if society says, oh, okay, the words client and independent are at the crux of what I would call a professional structural conflict of interest, or professional institutional conflict of interest, having to do with institutions and not who the particular person is so much. This conflict, what I call the professional conflict of interest, which is within the institutional type, broad type, is intrinsic to any line of work that is performed by a professional. Now, I found that so few people know what is necessary for a line of work to qualify as professional, that the term is commonly applied to virtually any job. The horse is out of the barn, as they say, meaning the spreading use of the term is only likely to continue. Everybody's a professional, right? Or more precisely, everybody claims to be a professional. It is almost forgotten societally that a professional line of work involves an emphasis on not only specialized knowledge and judgment, but also an obligation to the public interest. That is, even above one's own financial incentives. To enforce this obligation, professionals must pass typically an industry test on the knowledge part and be subject to laws and regulations governmental and in the industry, meant to ensure that the professionals do not compromise or even ignore their obligation to the public. Now, the CPA firm Arthur Andersen looked the other way when Enron created subsidiaries that the company controlled to get debt off the company's balance sheet. Investors and employees lost a lot of money, even retirements, because the auditors at Andersen put their own financial interest, meaning their firms, and themselves, above their obligation to protect the public from relying on inaccurate financial statements. We only need look at Lehman Brothers in 2007, 2008 to understand the financial system itself could collapse from just one CPA firm not flagging understatements of risks, such as real estate-based risks in this case, in a client company. The obligation to the public interest is indeed an important part of being a CPA. Other examples of professionals are lawyers, physicians, dentists, pharmacists. Now, managers, say real estate agents, construction workers, and even teachers are not professionals. Interestingly, neither are professors or research scholars. Even though being a professor or research scholar requires a lot of knowledge, and thus a pretty significant series of entry tests, I can attest to that, any obligation to the public which goes beyond not being fraudulent or not showing up for work or teaching badly is not salient in the profession. An obligation to do one's job, such as helping students to learn and publishing real results, not results designed to get consulting jobs, does not constitute an obligation to the public at large that the public really relies on, that is, beyond customers. The part about the consulting opportunities and forging results, empirical results, I have heard of that going on, and I think that is a conflict of interest, by the way. The professor does not, however, take a Hippocratic oath to practice honestly as physicians do. So knowledge, being an important part of one's job, such as a teacher or a professor or a research scholar, is necessary but not sufficient to be counted as a professional. Professors, by which I mean scholars holding a doctoral degree and being on a college or university faculty, are not professionals, whereas lawyers and physicians holding a bachelor's degree in law and medicine, respectively, are professionals. The crucial difference being in terms of how important the obligation to the public is. Now, therefore, I'm not a professional. Who would say that unless it were true? It goes against the tide of the expanding claims of entitlement that can be understood along the lines of what the American founding fathers called excess democracy. An obligation to the public can conflict with a professional's financial interest. Going the route of the latter constitutes exploiting the conflict of interest. The conflict itself, this is crucial, does not depend on a particular practitioner, as embezzlement does, and therefore it is not a conflict of interest, as embezzlement is. I use the terms institutional, systemic, and structural, of course, interchangeably here, to mean a conflict of interest that exists within or between institutions or positions therein, regardless of the particular people who happen to occupy the job positions and thus perform the official duties of the institutional roles. Think of Max Weber's bureaucracy. A conflict in which qualities of a particular person make a difference is called a personal conflict of interest. There might be, as I hinted before, there might be some of that in a professional, even a researcher's role of job in terms of the consulting. One person might embezzle while another would not. So one scholar might fabricate results to get a consulting job, another would not, would stand on academic principle. So even though, say, both people might occupy the very same position at the very same university, hypothetically, or in a company. Now, okay, institutional conflict of interests. Here's the problem. They tend to be larger as they involve a system, an organizational system, or a societal system, or a business system, or a governmental system. And therefore, they tend to be more damaging than the personal kind. Bertie Madoff would be maybe an exception. Nevertheless, we don't seem very concerned about the systemic flaws, preferring instead to focus on conflict of interest that stem from a person's own decision to personally benefit from his or her official role at the expense of the role's obligations to the public. So that would be a professional structural conflicts of interest in terms of obligation to the public. Regarding any conflicts of interest involving the role itself, regardless of who happens to occupy it, think of Weber again, we tend to assume that the institutions will sort out the problem, even though this task also involves a conflict of interest, because the institutions tend to benefit financially from roles in the broader system. Your, imagine someone saying to an employee, or executive saying to a manager, your position benefits from how the bank pays the rating agency, but we want you to come up with another arrangement by which the rating agency could be paid. And by the way, your position would no longer benefit from that. We assume the directive will be implemented by the employee to take the conflict of interest apart, regardless of the conflict of interest in the coming up of the alternative. This approach puts one conflict of interest on top of another. It is no accident that the American political economy is absolutely riddled with institutional conflicts that the public assumes have been eliminated, but go on, like CPA firms being paid by their clients, and rating agencies being paid by the issuers of the securities that are rated. Now, why are we so concerned about conflicts of interest? Why doesn't such concern translate into anger at institutional conflicts of interest? Why don't we have more motivation as a society to eliminate them? Why are we so naive to think that an institution is going to unpack its own conflict of interest? That is, where it itself is benefiting from the conflict of interest, such as a loophole. Now, conflicts of interest, systemic or personal, can be eliminated rather than tweaked with. With an individual, you could, fire the individual if you, But with institutions, you really have to go into looking at the structure, design of the institutions or the system. That's why those terms, institutional, structural, and systemic, can be used interchangeably. They're all in the mix. I suspect part of the explanation is that it's easier to be mad at a particular person for exploiting a personal conflict of interest by taking money, think of Madoff, than be mad at the accounting industry, really, or Congress as a whole. We are more likely to go after particular individuals than abstract organizations or macro systems. So we allow CPA firms to continue to be paid by companies themselves, their clients, in spite of the CPA's obligation to appear and be independent. This should be a no-brainer, that this should be taken apart. And yet many of us look the other way, even as it continues to go on, is allowed by the Dodd-Frank bill, or law now. Meanwhile, we pounce on individuals like Madoff, make out like bandits at the expense of investors. It is this difference that I'm trying to explain here. Why are we satisfied with allowing an institutional conflict of interest? Why do we do that even though it can be catastrophic? Think of Lehman Brothers. Is there no practical alternative? We tend to assume not, but there is. We tend to assume, even worse, that the person who's benefiting, or the institution that's benefiting from the conflict of interest, will somehow remove its own conflict of interest and then thus its own place of benefit in the system. That's incredible. It's asinine to assume that, and yet that seems to be in our society itself. It's so ingrained by this time. It's like a societal blind spot. We think, for example, we must wait for the members of Congress to remove a loophole, in spite of the fact that members of Congress, are currently betting financially from it. Now there's an example of distinguishing the institutional conflict of interest from the personal. Yes, individual members of Congress may differ on whether they take advantage of the loophole, but the loophole itself, aside from the attributes of particular members of Congress, their values, beliefs, principles, whatever, aside from all that, the conflict of interest is in the structure of design, or literally law, of the system. In this case, U.S. federal law. So we tend to ignore the conflict of interest, and then we just presume that members of Congress we'll have to vote to change it, and then we throw up our hands because, surprisingly, they're not. We do not have the peripheral vision, I think, necessary to recognize that we must go beyond Congress to extract the conflict of interest, such as that of leadership funds, that are protected by a law, loophole, that is passed by Congress. So this is a real problem. I think the bottom line is are two things. One, we don't, as a society, take institutional structural conflicts of interest seriously enough. We don't, for some reason, think that they're that bad, but we think that we can tolerate them as a society. And so, second of all, we really have no clue on how, once we realize how serious they are, how they are to be removed and not just tweeted with and twinked with and or tinkered with. And I think we just assume that the people who benefit from the conflict of interest, or the institutions, are going to do that, or that we have to wait for them to do it, that there's no other means. And that's what I mean by having this sort of horse blinder thing going on, and not seeing other alternatives. So I think it's no accident that we've, in 2008, the U.S. and the world economy, really the financial system, had a near taste of catastrophe, because many of us, and I think society as a whole, discounted the admittedly low probability, but dire possibility that the risk that these big banks like Lehman Brothers were undertaking was way beyond what we should, as a society, tolerate. So I appreciate you listening to me, and I hope you've learned something about conflicts of interest. Thank you.